the Hago tank, a Japanese catastrophe with armor thinner than a frying pan. On the 1st of May, 1933, a scene played out on Red Square in Moscow that changed the history of Japanese armored design for many years. Among the crowd of diplomats and military attachés stood Japanese Lieutenant Colonel Koga, who at a certain moment felt his heart rise to his throat. Across the cobblestone square, right before his eyes, a Soviet tank flashed by at incredible speed, the likes of which he had never seen before. The machine moved so fast that Koga barely managed to discern its silhouette before it disappeared around the corner. The Japanese officer, ignoring the beginning workers' demonstration, literally fled the stands and ran straight to the embassy to send an urgent encrypted dispatch to Tokyo. His report contained an alarming warning about a new Soviet superfast tank that could completely change the balance of power in the Far East. In Tokyo, the news caused real panic in the ranks of military planners. The Japanese Empire was just expanding its influence in Manchuria, and the prospect of a clash with the new Soviet armored weapon was unacceptable. Already, in July of the same year, the Mitsubishi concern received an urgent order to develop a fast tank that had to reach speeds exceeding 40 kilometers per hour. Japanese engineers faced quite a challenge, as they had to create a machine that would match the Soviet weapon while fitting into a limited budget and the production capabilities of the Japanese industry. After 11 months of intense work, Mitsubishi presented the first prototype. The machine achieved a speed of 43 kilometers per hour during tests, which seemed like a success. However, the constructor's joy quickly faded when the prototype drove onto the scales. The tank weighed 7.5 tons, meaning it was half a ton heavier than assumed in the specification. The military categorically demanded a reduction in mass because every additional kilogram meant worse performance and higher fuel consumption. A desperate fight for every gram began. Engineers started slimming down the machine using methods that would prove catastrophic for crews in the future. The most obvious solution was thinning the armor. The front armor plates, which initially had a thickness of 15 millimeters, were ruthlessly reduced to just 12 millimeters. That was a thickness barely exceeding a typical frying pan. Japanese constructors were perfectly aware that such armor would not protect the crew from serious fire. But the order was clear. The tank must be lighter and faster. After this drastic slimming cure, the mass dropped to 6.5 tons, and the speed increased to 45 kilometers per hour. The military was satisfied with the parameters, but no one thought about what this decision would mean for the people sitting inside. In February of the year 1935, the only example of the new tank took part in great maneuvers in the region of the Manchurian-Mongolian border. Along with it drove 10 Type 89 tanks and 3 Type 94 tankettes. Mongolian border guards, observing these maneuvers from afar, apparently decided to pretend they did not see anything. After the exercises concluded, the tank was officially accepted into armament under the designation 2595, which corresponded to the year 2595 in the Japanese system of counting years from the mythical ascension to the throne of the first emperor Jimmu. However, soldiers quickly began calling this machine simply Ha-Go, which meant third type. The tank received a completely original chassis design named the Hara suspension, after Major Harada, who designed it. Interestingly, machines intended for service in freezing Manchuria received a reinforced version of this suspension with additional small wheels in the middle of each bogie. An inline, six-cylinder, two-stroke diesel engine with air cooling and a capacity of 14 3/10 liters was chosen as the drive. This motor threw out 120 horsepower at 3,800 revolutions per minute. The engine was placed on the right side, from where a long drive shaft stretched to the gearbox located at the front. Here, the real fun with the design began. Although the motor sat on the right side, the gearbox was located centrally to the left of the driver, who sat by the right hull wall. The connection was realized using a complicated combination of shafts that looked like some desperate improvisation. On the left side, next to the gearbox, sat the gunner mechanic, who not only operated the machine gun but also had to service the engine. The driver, in turn, was just a driver, without any mechanical duties, which was quite an unusual solution. The machine gun fired by the mechanic was a tank version of the Type 11 machine gun, developed in the 11th year of Emperor Taisho's reign by General Kirijiro Nambu. This machine gun had an absolutely unique, one might say crazy, ammunition feed system. It did not use belts or magazines, but loaded with 6 rifle clips from the Arisaka carbine. These clips were placed into a special hopper located on the left side of the receiver. The barrel protruding outside was protected by a metal cover intended to prevent damage, although in practice it often hindered more than it helped. Besides the machine gun in the hull, the Heigo tank possessed one more machine gun in the turret, but it was not coaxial with the main 37mm gun. Instead, it was placed at an angle of 135 degrees relative to the cannon's axis. Moreover, the cannon itself did not have a fixed axis, as it could be moved horizontally in a range of 10 degrees without rotating the turret. No mechanisms were used for this purpose. The gunner had to move the barrel left, right, up, and down by sheer muscle strength, leaning against a shoulder rest. One can imagine what aiming looked like while driving over uneven terrain, when the tank bounced on bumps and the gunner desperately tried to keep the barrel pointed at the target. The gun used in the Heigo was a turret version of the 37mm infantry anti-tank gun. When converting to the tank version, the barrel had to be shortened from 46 1/10 to 37 6/10 calibers. A shell weighing 680 grams flew out of such a barrel at a speed of 575 meters per second. This kinetic energy was enough to pierce 35mm armor at a distance of 300 meters, which sounded quite good on paper. All this together made up a tank that was supposed to be the Japanese answer to Soviet fast-armored machines. However, no one realized then that one of the most unsuccessful armored designs in history had just been created. The 12mm armor was soon to show its true value in combat, and Japanese tankers were to find out on their own skin what it means to fight in a can that protects worse than ordinary steel sheet from a stove. August of the year 1937 brought Japanese tankers on the Heigo a real hell near Shanghai. The Chinese army prepared the city's defense with unexpected determination, and its armored forces included 3 battalions of tanks. The 1st Battalion disposed of 29 British Vickers Carden Loyd tankettes with a single machine gun and 9mm frontal armor, and 3 Vickers 6-ton tanks. The 2nd Battalion possessed 17 Vickers Mark tanks, on the basis of which the Polish 7TP and Soviet T-26 were created, plus another 17 tankettes and 4 French Renault ZB tankettes. The 3rd Battalion had in stock 15 German Panzerkampfwagen 1 tanks, 20 Italian Carro Veloce, 33 tankettes, 18 wheeled armored cars, and 12 vehicles with guns. Japanese commanders expected an easy passage through Chinese positions. The Hago were simply supposed to roll through the defense lines like a steel roller, breaking resistance before the Chinese soldier had time to react. On the first day of the battle, everything went according to plan for the first 2 hours. The column of Hago moved forward, and the Chinese infantry began to retreat. Suddenly, 4 British Vickers Marks from the 2nd Battalion rolled out of a side street. Even though they had only 13mm frontal armor, their machine guns began methodically strafing the Japanese machines. Japanese tankers discovered with horror that bullets were bouncing off their own armor with a deafening clatter, and small pieces of metal were starting to fall off from the inside. One of the Japanese drivers, 20-year-old Private Tanaka, suddenly felt a sharp pain in his cheek. He touched his face and saw blood on his hand. A small metal fragment chipped off from the inside of the armor after a rifle bullet hit had cut his skin like a razor. At the same moment, the gunner in his tank, Corporal Yoshida, screamed in pain. A lead bullet fragment that had penetrated through the observation slit struck him in the shoulder. Yoshida tried to continue aiming with the 37mm gun, but blood was flooding his eyes and the pain was unbearable. Tanaka, in panic, stepped on the gas, and the Hago sped forward, moving away from the Vickers firing at it. Behind him, 2 more Japanese tanks were burning, hit by Chinese field artillery. The real nightmare began, however, when the Hago drove into a district where Chinese infantry had prepared an ambush. From the windows of tenements, from behind barricades, from roofs, from every possible place, fire suddenly erupted from hundreds of rifles. Rifle bullets hit the Japanese tanks like metal hail, creating a ceaseless infernal racket. Inside the machines, it became like being inside a bell struck by 100 hammers simultaneously. Japanese tankers covered their heads with their hands, trying to somehow endure this deafening noise. But the noise was the least of their problems. Larger and larger pieces of metal began chipping off from the inside of the 12mm armor, flying around the interior of the tank like grenade shrapnel. The commander of one of the Hago, Lieutenant Yamamoto, watched through the periscope as his men fell wounded one by one from their own armor. The mechanic lost an eye after being hit by a metal fragment. The driver had a torn face. Yamamoto himself was hit in the thigh and felt warm blood flowing down his leg. Through the unsecured observation slit, rifle bullet fragments and lead spatter flew inside. One of the soldiers began to scream that he could not see because lead had gotten into his eye. Yamamoto issued the order to withdraw, but at that moment the Hago's engine coughed and died. A Chinese bullet had hit some important element of the cooling system. The crew had to abandon the tank and flee on foot under a hail of bullets. Of the 20 Hago that began this attack, only 11 returned to the starting lines. The remaining 9 were either burning on the streets of Shanghai or had been abandoned by crews who preferred to flee on foot than continue sitting in steel coffins. Worse still, the Chinese lost only 2 Vickers and 1 tankette in this clash. The Japanese commanders were shaken. Their modern fast tanks, which were supposed to ensure advantage on the battlefield, turned out to be deadly traps for their own crews. The 12mm armor, which was supposed to protect the people inside, turned into a source of shrapnel, wounding its own soldiers under rifle fire. At night, after the battle, Japanese officers interrogated wounded tankers, trying to understand what went wrong. Each of them told the same terrifying story. The armor did not withstand even intensive rifle fire. Pieces of metal were falling off from the inside. Fragments of bullets and lead spatter were flying in through observation slits. The noise was so deafening that some soldiers lost their hearing. One of the tankers cried while recounting how he saw his friend get hit by a fragment of his own armor straight in the neck and bleed out on the bottom of the tank within a few minutes. The Japanese command faced a serious dilemma. They had hundreds of Heigo ready to be sent to the front, but now it became clear that sending people in them was almost certain death. Feverish work began on improving the machines. Someone came up with the idea to glue a layer of asbestos to the inside of the armor. It was supposed to catch metal fragments falling off during fire. The idea sounded reasonable, so the installation of asbestos linings in new Heigo examples began quickly. No one thought then about the fact that asbestos is deadly dangerous to health and that Japanese tankers who survived the war would die years later from lung cancer. Another improvement was securing the observation slits with special glass blocks. They were supposed to stop bullet fragments and lead spatter from flying into the tank's interior. In practice, these glass blocks often cracked after the first stronger hit, and their shards wounded tankers just as effectively as lead spatter. Despite this, Japanese engineers considered it a success and began mass-mounting glass blocks in the Heigo. The battle for Nanking in December of the same year brought further disappointment. The Chinese 3rd Armored Battalion with German Panzer Is and Italian tankettes tried to defend the city's outskirts. The Hago moved to attack supported by heavier Type 89 tanks. For the first hours of combat, everything went well. Chinese tankettes did not pose a serious threat, and their 9mm armor cracked like an eggshell after being hit by Japanese 37mm guns. However, when the Heigo encountered the German panzers, the situation again spiraled out of control. The German tanks had 13mm frontal armor, only 1mm thicker than the Hago, but their crews were much better trained. German instructors who trained the Chinese tankers taught them a basic rule: shoot first and shoot accurately. The Chinese in the panzers opened fire from a distance of 600 meters before the Hago managed to get close enough for the effective range of their guns. The first 3 Japanese tanks burst into flames within a minute. Japanese tankers in panic began shooting chaotically, but their shells did not have enough energy to pierce the armor at such a distance. Captain Suzuki, commanding the Hago company, screamed the order to withdraw over the radio. His own tank had just taken a hit that damaged the track. The machine stopped in place, spinning in circles. Suzuki tried to get out through the hatch, but at that moment another Chinese shell struck the turret. Suzuki felt something warm and wet flowing down his back. He turned his head and saw that his gunner no longer had half his face. The captain finally got outside and began running toward the Japanese lines, leaving the burning Hago behind him. After the fall of Nanking, the Japanese command decided to draw conclusions. The Hago were not suitable for fighting enemy tanks. Their armor was too thin, the gun too weak, and crews were dying at a frightening rate. A decision was made that the Heigo would be used mainly to support infantry against an unarmed adversary. Heavier machines were to be used for fights with tanks. Hundreds of Heigo were withdrawn from China and transported to Manchuria, where they waited for a real challenge that was to come very soon. July of the year 1938 brought Japanese tankers another bitter experience at Lake Khasan on the Manchurian-Soviet border. The Japanese command decided that this was the ideal moment to test the Hago against a real Soviet adversary. A company consisting of 15 Hago and infantry support received the order to take Zaozernaya Hill, which the Russians called Bezimia Naya. Japanese officers assured their men that the Soviet T-26, which they saw at the parade in Moscow 5 years earlier, was not as terrible as intelligence reports proclaimed. The attack began at dawn. The Hago moved uphill, leading infantrymen behind them. They passed the first 200 meters without a problem. Suddenly, fire burst from the forest thickets on the top of the hill, but these were not machine guns or light anti-tank guns. These were Soviet 45mm anti-tank guns, the existence of which Japanese planners had not even taken into account. The first Hago exploded so violently that its turret flew 20 meters to the side. The second burst into flames after a hit to the engine. The third tried to turn back, but the track slipped off the road wheels and the machine stood defenseless under fire. Sergeant Kobayashi, commanding one of the Hago, screamed at his driver to drive zigzag. But on the steep slope of the hill, such a maneuver was practically impossible. Suddenly, the whole tank shook from a powerful blow. A Soviet 45mm shell pierced the front armor like a knife through butter and flew out through the rear wall, killing the mechanic along the way. Kobayashi, deafened and wounded by shrapnel, managed to get out through the top hatch and began rolling down the slope. Behind his back, the remaining Hago one by one became burning wrecks. Of the 15 tanks that began the attack, not a single one reached the top of the hill. All were destroyed within 20 minutes. The Japanese infantry without armored support was massacred by Soviet machine gun fire. The Japanese command announced that it was a mistake of the planners, who did not take into account the difficult terrain and did not identify Soviet artillery positions. No one wanted to admit out loud the obvious truth. The Hago were simply hopeless in a clash with real anti-tank guns. After this catastrophe, Japanese engineers returned to the drawing boards. They decided to lengthen the barrel of the 37mm gun to increase the projectile's muzzle velocity. After modification, the shell flew out at a speed of 675 meters per second, instead of the previous 575. On paper, it looked impressive. In practice, it meant that the Hago could now pierce 35mm armor at a distance of 400 meters instead of 300. The Soviet T-34 had 45mm of frontal armor, so this modification changed little. In parallel, the Japanese Army was switching to a new, stronger cartridge of caliber 7.7mm, with a casing length of 58mm. A bullet with a mass of 11 3/10 grams flew out of the 650mm barrel at a speed of 741 meters per second. A new machine gun was developed for this cartridge, which the Japanese simply copied from Chinese trophies. It was the Czech ZB-26, produced in Great Britain as the Bren. The Japanese did not bother with a license and simply made a 1-to-1 copy. The new machine guns began finding their way into the Hago, replacing the old Type 11 with its absurd clip-feed system. All these modifications were supposed to prepare the Hago for the real test, which was to come in May 1939 on the Khalkhin-Gol River in Mongolia. The Japanese command planned a great offensive that was to settle the question of borders between Manchuria and Mongolia once and for all. Hundreds of Hago stood in bases, being prepared for battle. Their crews underwent intensive training. Everyone knew that something big was coming. However, no one expected what a great massacre it would end in. May of the year 1939 on the Khalkhin-Gol River became the blackest day in history for Japanese tankers. The Japanese command gathered 87 Hago and 35 heavier Type 89 tanks for the great offensive against Soviet Mongolian forces. The plan assumed a quick breakthrough across the Mongolian steppe and crushing the enemy before he managed to bring in reinforcements. Japanese generals were convinced that their numerical superiority and the element of surprise would ensure their victory. On the 28th of May at 4 in the morning, the Japanese armored column moved to attack. The Hago drove in the lead, tasked with quickly reaching the river crossings. For the first half hour, everything went according to plan. The Mongolian cavalry was retreating before the attacking tanks. Suddenly, strange machines emerged from the hills on the left side of the Japanese column, the likes of which Japanese tankers had never seen before. These were Soviet BT-7s, fast tanks of Christie design, which could reach a speed of 60 kilometers per hour. Behind them came heavier T-28s with 45mm guns. The Soviet flank attack totally surprised the Japanese. The BT-7s sped at incredible speed straight into the flank of the Japanese column, strafing the Hago with their 45mm guns. Japanese tanks tried to turn back to face the threat, but their slow manual turret rotation mechanisms could not keep up with the speed of the Soviet assault. The first Hago was hit in the side where the armor was only 10mm thick. The tank exploded immediately, killing the entire crew. Another 3 Hago burst into flames within the next 2 minutes. Lieutenant Nakamura, commanding a platoon of 5 Hago, tried to organize a defense. He shouted the order over the radio to form a line of tanks facing the enemy. But before his men managed to execute the maneuver, a Soviet T-28 stopped on a hillock 800 meters away from them and calmly, methodically, began destroying the Japanese machines one by one. Nakamura saw through the periscope as a shell flew through the air and hit the Hago of his deputy. The turret tore off the hull and flew up like a toy. Nakamura screamed at the driver to drive forward at full speed. Maybe if they got close to 300 meters, they would manage to do something. Nakamura's Hago sped forward, bouncing on the unevenness of the steppe. The gunner tried to aim the 37mm gun, but with such driving, it was impossible. Suddenly, another Soviet shell struck the right side of the tank. Nakamura felt terrible pain in his leg and saw that the mechanic lay motionless with a large hole in his chest. The engine began to smoke. The driver screamed that he was losing control. Nakamura issued the order to abandon the tank. The 3 surviving crew members jumped outside and began fleeing on foot, while Soviet shells exploded around them. By noon, of the 87 Hago that began the battle, only 23 remained on the battlefield. The rest were burning or lying torn to pieces. The Soviet counterattack was so fast and massive that the Japanese command completely lost control of the situation. The Type 89 tanks tried to save what could be saved, but they also suffered heavy losses. Soviet BT-7s drove around Japanese formations like wolves around a flock of sheep, choosing subsequent targets and destroying them from a safe distance. On the 3rd of July, after more than a month of continuous fighting, the Japanese command admitted defeat and withdrew the remaining forces. Of over 100 tanks that took part in the campaign on the Khalkhin Gol, barely 18 returned to bases in Manchuria. Most of the Hago were destroyed or abandoned on the steppe. Japanese generals wrote detailed reports in which they blamed everything for the defeat: bad terrain, the enemy's numerical superiority, the element of surprise. Only about one thing they did not want to write: that the Hago were deadly dangerous traps that sent their crews to certain death against any serious adversary. After this catastrophe, most of the surviving Hago were withdrawn from the front line and transferred to garrison units in Manchuria, and on the Pacific Islands. There they were to wait quietly until the end of the war, used mainly for patrolling and intimidating the local population. No one planned to use them against real tanks anymore. The 12mm armor, which was supposed to be sufficient for fast raids, turned out to be a deadly illusion of safety. The year 1943 found hundreds of Hago scattered across small garrisons on the islands of the Pacific. The Japanese command decided that these tanks could still serve to defend fortified positions against American landings. On the island of Tarawa, 14 Hago were stationed, buried up to their turrets in the ground, intended to fulfill the role of immobile fire bunkers. Japanese engineers considered this a brilliant idea, because a buried tank presented a smaller target and its gun could still fire. On the 20th of November, the American landing struck Tarawa. The first waves of Marines encountered fire from the buried Hago, but the Americans quickly realized that they were dealing with immobile targets. They called in support from Sherman tanks, which crawled to a distance of 300 meters and began calmly destroying the Japanese positions one by one. 75mm shells from the Shermans pierced the 12mm armor of the Hago like paper. Within 4 hours, all 14 buried tanks turned into smoking graves for their crews. On Saipan, the Japanese crew of one Hago decided to carry out a desperate night counteroffensive against American positions. Corporal Sato led his tank through the jungle, hoping to surprise the enemy. Suddenly, an American Sherman appeared in the darkness. Sato had no chance of escape. He fired his 37mm gun, but the shell bounced off the thick armor of the Sherman without causing any damage. The answer came immediately. The Sherman fired once, and the Hago exploded. Sato managed to crawl out of the burning wreck with severe burns. He was the only survivor of his 4-person crew. By the end of the year 1944, practically all Hago stationed on the Pacific Islands were destroyed by the Americans. Those that remained in Manchuria lived to see August of the year 45, when the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. The Soviet armored attack was so fast and massive that Japanese units did not have time to organize a defense. A Hago company stationed near Mukden tried to stop the approaching Soviet T-34s, but was literally run over in half an hour. Soviet tankers did not even stop. They simply drove over Japanese positions, crushing the Hago under their tracks. After Japan's capitulation, the remaining examples of the Hago were confiscated by the Allies or dismantled for scrap. Some fell into the hands of Chinese communists who tried to use them during the Civil War, but quickly realized that these machines were good for nothing. The last Hago stopped driving somewhere in the late 40s, ending their pitiful career as garbage cans on provincial Chinese military bases. The tank, which was supposed to be the Japanese answer to Soviet fast armored machines, turned out to be one of the most unsuccessful armored designs of the Second World War. Its 12mm armor, thinner than a frying pan, sent thousands of Japanese tankers to their deaths, who had to fight in machines protecting them worse than an ordinary steel box. If you like this story about the Japanese armored absurdity, leave a like under this material, write in the comment what you think about the Hago, and definitely subscribe to the channel so as not to miss further fascinating stories about the strangest military technology. See you in the next episode.